Greg Coleridge. I'm the outreach director for the Move2Amend coalition, group that's been around since the 2010 Citizens United decision. People who gathered together and thought that was going to happen, that it was going to be a very terrible decision, and that we needed to come together to respond, resist, but also to understand how that the problems associated with Citizens United in terms of money being defined as speech and corrupting the political process, but also how corporations have acquired constitutional rights, how that has been used, abused, and misused over a very long time, that we needed to respond to those issues as well that predate Citizens United by a very long time, to not just speak to the horrors of the impact negative that's drowning out the voice of people without money and giving even greater power and rights to corporations, but to use it as, we think, a democratic moment to promote a viable alternative that we think will address some of these specific problems that have been stifling people for a very long time, to create a society that will meet people's needs and provide justice in all of its forms by abolishing corporate personhood and money as speech, to promote a constitutional amendment that would not just overturn Citizens United, but deal with these predated also constitutional doctrines that have equated money as free speech and corporations as persons with inalienable constitutional rights in a variety of different ways.
Who is Move2Amend? Who are the people that make up Move2Amend?
Yeah. Well, again, it's been around since 2010, and it's made up of people of all stripes from around the country. 450,000 people have signed our motion to amend petition at move2amend.org. And they constitute people who are concerned about the lack of the ability to make decisions affecting their lives pertaining to environmental issues, education, healthcare, good governance, you name it. The corporatization or privatization affects so many issues across the board from coast to coast, impacting people of all political persuasions, of all races. So we are intergenerational, multicultural, believing that this movement must and absolutely be transpartisan, and that it has to be politically independent. We can't be a front group to any political party, and we must be financially independent. We can't be dependent on the corporate crowd or big foundations or labor unions or government, because if you're trying to build a social movement, you're trying to make it authentically democratic from the inside out. We're not just promoting democracy, but we're doing it. We're exhibiting it. We're making sure that people around the table, those who are negatively impacted by all of this, have an authentic voice in this. Then we can't have financial strings attached to these, because we know historically, looking at other social movements, that they have been co-opted by others and just become a shell of their former selves, and rather be small but independent from those inside the beltway corporate entities or front groups, and truly authentically try to represent the people at the grassroots. That's how you build an authentic and ultimately powerful social movement. I think it's more descriptive to say corporatization over privatization. Privatization almost gives the impression of, oh, it's a mom and pop outfit that's taking over our airports or picking up our trash or running our healthcare systems or running our prisons. No, it's not mom and pop. It's these giant entities whose primary motivation is maximizing profit and keeping out regular ordinary people to make decisions affecting, it's private, it's insular, it's beyond the reach of we the people. And if we believe that, we the people means anything authentic, that it's ever been that way to begin with, then we've got to have a seat at the table in making these decisions, and not cordoned off like some moat, with alligators in it, and that these decisions are shielded. But that's what's happened. The courts have done that. So all of these decisions regarding money as speech and who defines the relationship between people and corporations used to be sort of a legislative decision. made between legislators who gave only privileges, not rights, to corporations when they issued a charter. That was a democratic instrument. All of that has been hijacked or usurped or, dare I say, trumped, preempted by the ability of corporations and money to go to court and say, no, these are not legislative decisions where people and those we elect decide. These are judicial decisions. And once you shift decision-making from sort of the legislative arena to the judicial arena, it's beyond the reach of we the people. And that's why things have gotten so much worse. And seemingly there's been this increasing disconnect between what people want on issue after issue and the kind of policies we have or don't have, because precisely and exactly it's because people are beholden, who we elect, increasingly to the corporate crowd and well-to-do, or it's even beyond the reach of the legislative people we elect because those decisions have come from activist courts. So even if you elect Gandhi, Mother Teresa, Dorothy Day in Congress, there's only so much they can do to bring change in the legislative or regulatory arena if you ignore the constitutional arena. You've got to address, in part, the constitutional arena. And that's what we're trying to do by calling for a 28th constitutional amendment called the We the People Amendment.
You've been going at this for 8 years?
Coming up on 9 years.
9 years. Yeah. What's going to happen? What's got to happen differently now?
Yeah.
To make it happen?
Yeah. Well, I think there's just this growing realization that what's happening is not working, that there's an ever greater chasm between what's needed and what's happening or not happening. And spurned on by some of these fundamental crises that we are facing in multiple arenas, from not just political, but economic, ecological, social, that, we're reaching saturation points, tipping points, points where we're coming upon limits, whether they're physical limits or ecological limits, or just willing to put up with things as they are. And what we're told is how things are supposed to operate, and the reality that they aren't. People can only continue in that sort of narrative where you believe the myth and the lore and it's not real until you say, no, I'm not going to believe it anymore. And I think we're rapidly approaching those, whatever you want to call them, saturation points, tipping points, extremes before something fundamental changes. You can only metaphorically kick the can down the road so long before people say, basta, enough, and nibbling around the edges and putting Band-Aids on. And yeah, we need to continue to respond and react and resist to the latest individual onslaught coming down the pike, which seems never ending, but they're never ending. And will always be, guess what? Responding, resisting, and reacting forever and ever and ever, unless we at least spend some time not just trying to, help people who are coming out of homes that are on fire, but asking, who are the arsonists? Who are the arsonists causing the fire to begin with? And I think that goes back to what we're doing. More and more people are coming to the conclusion, coming from where they are, whether they're trying to create, true, legitimate health care or a decent environment or transportation system that, is sustainable, or an economy that provides decent jobs at fair wages, producing useful goods and services. The whole bubble of everything is, an everything bubble is coming. There are just so many arenas. More and more people coming from all of these different places are realizing. And farm issues, look at family farmers, particularly in places like the Midwest. It's the agribusinesses that are dominating, defining, and authorizing what goes on, not them. And so they're at an economic disadvantage and just being devoured, as small businesses are everywhere. And it's the small businesses that aren't the ones that are buying, renting, leasing, and retaining public officials. It's the big guys. So even small businesses, even coalitions of small businesses have come out in favor of this kind of effort, because they're not the ones that are spending the money or lobbying. Where I come from, and increasingly as I go around, people, small business are just trying to survive. and deal with the big box stores and the like. This would go a very long way to bring about change, and in particular what it is we're calling for in this amendment, We the People Amendment, is basically two components, radical concepts. One is that only human beings are human beings. You know, natural persons are natural persons. Corporations are artificial persons created by the state. Without a state, you'd still have people. Without government, human beings would still be human beings. Without government, there is no thing like a corporation. Those are created by government. They are instruments of government, and therefore we, the people, should have the ability, and at one time had the ability and the power and the authority to define what they could and could not do. So this is basically, in a sense, not radical at all. It's quite moderate in terms of its asking and demanding, and if it and when it comes to pass, it would simply go back to what one time once was, that corporations were defined and authorized by we the people. So let's have that democratic discussion of what should be the powers and privileges and protections of corporations, instead of, again, it being shielded by the courts where we are just on the outside either clapping or booing, but have no real voice in that decision making. The second part of this, We the People Amendment, calls for money no longer being defined, political money, as free speech, to be donated or invested in elections like a tsunami amount, which is what's gone on. Let's have a democratic discussion in our Congresses, in our state legislatures, in our city halls about what should be the appropriate amount of money on various races, how much of it should be private, how much of it should be public. We're not calling for any one of these exact prescriptions. We're just saying, again, sort of conservatively, that the decisions like that should go back into the legislative arena where those discussions and debates can happen. It's also pretty important what goes on at that constitutional arena, because that's where the basic rules that govern what candidates who are elected can do and what kind of laws and regulations get passed are basically overarching or undergirding. And we think the enactment of these ground rules will level the political playing field, if you will, and create a much more robust and authentic, trustworthy system that people will feel like, okay, we can now feel that government does in fact much more represent us. Now let's deal with some of these issues around justice, peace, lack of sustainability that is way overdue from being addressed, that have been ignored. There are two ways to amend the Constitution, one of which is to be very specific, that we're trying to get Congress to call for a convention. You need 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate. It then passes the federal level, and it has to be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures. Very specific. There's a second way under this article in the Constitution, Article 5, to amend the Constitution, and that is to call for a very specific, issue or amendment-specific convention that would do an end run around Congress, that goes directly getting state legislatures to say, we want a convention like just for this, nothing more, just for this. Now, a lot of people, quite honestly, when they hear about convention, they sort of freak out at the prospect of, oh my gosh, this could be hijacked. You may go in for this, but it may come out for that, bait and switch. A concern. On the one hand, although the Constitution, the reading of it seems to be pretty clear that if you go in for this, you got to, or whatever it is, you have to come out with yay or nay. And if it's yay, it can only be for, say, the We the People Amendment. It can't be for something entirely different. And we're calling for the traditional way of the 2/3 of each branch and of the state legislatures to validate or to confirm. However, it should be said, historically, over the last century, that the threat of a constitutional convention has been enough to move Congress quicker on some things that were enacted that maybe they weren't already inclined to support. The 17th Amendment, which ended appointment of senators by state legislatures, that was in the Congress, or in the Constitution. Many states said, we want a constitutional convention for that. And that caused Congress to move swiftly. They wanted to control the process, wanted to control what that language would be. So that put the feet under their fire. Ending the poll tax, same thing, 24th Amendment, I think, and other amendments in the last century. The threat of a constitutional convention was enough to get Congress to move. So we're continuing to do the normal types of traditional lobbying and organizing and the like to get, and there's already 65 co-sponsors in the House. This is going to be introduced in the Senate next year, and we'll get a lot more co-sponsors, we think, in the House. But keeping this threat alive is something that we think is worthwhile. A lot of people, when they hear about these issues they seem quite large. The lift seems very heavy. You're trying to amend the Constitution. It doesn't happen every day. And particularly when you think about sort of corporate power, corporate rule, and the huge amount of money in elections, so many people think that what's going on today is inevitable, is irreversible, it's kind of how it was meant to be. It's sort of like the sun, the earth revolving around the sun, or gravity, or like the tides coming in and out. These are things that are sort of physical, law of physics that we really can't do a whole lot about. That's nonsense. What has gone on in both of these arenas? Money being defined as speech, corporations gaining all of these rights, not just political free speech rights, but other sorts of preemptions of other parts of the Constitution. That includes the 4th Amendment, 5th Amendment, 14th Amendment, Commerce Clause. All these other pieces that we include in our amendment, not just money and speech and corporate constitutional rights, but all of these other ones. Many people think this is inevitable or reversible. No. These have happened because of deliberate and intentional decision-making by certain people. What has been consciously and deliberately done, we think can consciously and deliberately be undone. There is no inevitability in what's going on today continuing. There isn't. And so it's important to understand that we think we are on the right side of what is truly inevitable. And that our proposal calls for what we believe is the whole enchilada approach, not just changing a little bit of it, because generationally, if you look at the history of this country, there's really you only get kind of one chance in a generation to have a constitutional amendment. Shouldn't it be worthwhile? We think it should be, and that's why we're calling for an end of all never intended constitutional rights, all of these, not just related to money and politics.